love this place. I've been here for a lot of poetry readings, and it's my favorite place to be. And when I found out that my friend Guy was coming to speak here, that was super plus. So I'm glad you're all out to hear the latest in what's going on with abrupt climate change and everything else. I want to say before Guy comes out that there is a little blue ceramic jar up there on the bar. And if you could on your way out or anytime drop a couple bucks in there for Guy's tour, that'd be awesome. He does this from his heart, as most of you know. That'd be great. So I told Guy, I'm just a poet. I don't know what to say except to welcome him because he's wonderful and he's a truth teller. And I'm glad to hear what he has to say again tonight because every time I hear Guy, as you know, it's a different day, different news. So please welcome Guy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mimi. Thanks to Craig, who provides this space for us. Thanks to Randy, who hosted this portion of this 5-week tour, which began in Fairbanks, Alaska, so long ago I can barely remember. So Mimi said, I can't introduce you, I'm just a poet. In the very end, civilizations perish because they listen to their politicians and not to their poets. So that convinced her to get her ass down here. So the first thing I want to point out is that you don't have to say anything about these things I'm about to tell you. And I would proceed very cautiously with your family, with your friends, before you just spring this on them. A few years ago, I was speaking in Chico, California. A young lady heard me speak. She got in the cab with a cab driver she didn't know, and next thing you know, she makes it halfway home and she's thrown out on the street. She mentioned what I'd been talking about, and it didn't go well at all. And that was just the cab driver. So you can imagine if you tell people you are close to without much warning about this information, you really need to provide a trigger warning. So maybe you don't want to say something, and how I frequently introduce this topic is, if we know there's an asteroid coming at Earth and we know that it's going to hit Earth in the very near future, we don't know the day, we don't know the hour, but we know, then do you want to know? Do you want me to tell you that the asteroid is headed here and within the next few years it's going to hit Earth? And then some people leave. And almost everybody says, yeah, I want to know. And then I tell them about abrupt climate change, and they say, I didn't want to know that. I wanted to know about the asteroid. There was never an asteroid. It's a metaphor. People. So let's go back in time to 1750, when we say the Industrial Revolution began. It actually began probably in the 1400s, maybe before, with the first civilizations. As soon as we started putting shovels into the ground, we were releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. But let's just assume we're going back to 1750, when scientists largely agree was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Fast forward a few years, almost 100 in fact, and we have George Perkins Marsh, U.S. ambassador and naturalist in the 1840s, warning about climate change, specifically global warming, as a result of burning fossil fuels. 1840s. And then Sir John Tyndall in 1847 providing the mechanism. Svante Arrhenius, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for unrelated work, pointing out with the first refereed journal article in 1896 and predicting a global average rise in temperature of 1 degree Celsius by the year 2000. Two things very clever about that. It was 1896, April of 1896, and he made this prediction 104 years in advance, and it was about 3/4 of a degree above the 1750 baseline 104 years later, which is pretty impressive, so that's pretty good. And second, it was 104 years later, so he was dead, so nobody could point out that he got it wrong, which is really clever. I wish all my predictions were about the far distant future, and my email inbox would be filled with a lot less animus had I been doing that. Then we go to 1965. The chief of the American Petroleum Institute, Frank Eichert, is speaking to the congregation at the American Petroleum Institute annual meeting, 1965, and he said, we are very close to the end. Actually, the direct quote was, we are running out of time with respect to climate change. That's 1965. Wow. And then he imagined that we would completely transform our economy, stop using petroleum products and burning coal, and just turn the whole thing around on a dime, and we'd still have flying cars. That's 1965. Along comes the mid-1980s. Al Gore and Carl Sagan are on the floor of Congress, 1985, warning us about climate changes that will look a lot like the ones we see today. James Hansen, 1988, again speaking before Congress. All these stories appeared in the New York Times, so it's not like, we were avoiding the topic. So 1988, James Hansen is on the floor of Congress saying pretty much the same thing, repeating the words of Sagan and Gore and pointing out that we're headed for a really catastrophic future if we don't stop burning fossil fuels. So, 200 years of warnings later, if you pursue a scorched earth policy long enough, you end up with a scorched earth. What do you know? Who'd have thunk it? Noah Braun, the director of the New York office of the United Nations Environment Program, pointed out, and this was in the Associated Press, so it appeared in every major newspaper in the country, pointed out that we have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve this greenhouse gas problem. 1989. United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, not just one individual now, but a collected body that synthesizes all the known research at the time in October of 1990 and concludes that if we reach 1 degree Celsius above the 1750 baseline, that will trigger these self-reinforcing feedback loops that they called rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses. And this is important, that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. These folks knew that we were directly connected and dependent upon healthy, functioning ecosystems. If we start messing with ecosystems and cause extensive ecosystem damage, we don't survive. Interestingly, the United Nations knew this in 1989 and proposed an upper limit of 1 degree C, but now they propose 2 degrees C, a temperature at which there's never been Homo sapiens on the planet, as being somehow safe. Time magazine comes along, April of 2006, and says, be very worried, indicating that we're already experiencing profound loss of habitat for Homo sapiens as a result of climate change. 2006. David Spratt, climate writer and speaker, in October 2014 says, we actually triggered those self-reinforcing feedback loops, those rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 degree above the 1750 baseline. If it was 1/4 degree, none of us were alive then. So we triggered these self-reinforcing feedback loops before anybody in this room showed up on the planet. See, it's not my fault. And it's not yours either. Antonio Guterres, currently Secretary General of the United Nations, says we have until 2020 to change course. The warnings keep coming. Are we changing course? No, of course not. With respect to burning fossil fuels, it's pedal to the metal, baby. If we're going over the cliff, we're going Thelma and Louise style. We're not going to hit the brakes on the way down. And then profoundly, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their 2018 report says, we don't have till 2100, folks, we have until 2030. A profound change that probably most of you heard about and then forgot about a week later. And they point out that there are clear benefits to maintaining global average temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline as opposed to 2 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline. With respect to extinction, it's all about the rate of change. I'm a conservation biologist. I study rates of change of the environment. And specifically, I study changes in habitat. Humans are vertebrates. Humans are mammals. So when a paper comes out projecting very slow rates of change will outstrip the ability of vertebrates to keep out by a factor of 10,000 times, we should take note. This from the peer-reviewed journal literature, among the most conservative sources on Earth. And then just last year, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the same applies to mammals. Humans are vertebrate mammals. We're outstripping the ability of vertebrates and mammals to keep up by many orders of magnitude. So that's inconvenient. I try to be optimistic. So far, it's not working very well. So if we're causing the loss of vertebrates and we're causing the loss of mammals, and we are vertebrate mammals, you can see where this is going. Scorched earth, success, mission accomplished. So what I've been proposing for many years is the notion of planetary hospice. After all, if hospice at the individual level is designed to comfort the afflicted in their final days, if it's about honesty instead of hope or wishful thinking, and if that works at the level of individuals, then perhaps we should try it at the level of our species, at the level of our society. So planetary hospice, in my mind, is the way forward. I have a quote here from Stephen Jenkinson, who has spent his entire adult life in what he calls the death trade. And he points out that the great enemy of grief is hope, the four-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Hope, in other words, is wishful thinking. And in fact, you look at the definition, hope is to want something to happen or be true. I want a lot of things to happen. Mimi mentioned you could drop a few dollars in the blue jar on the way out. If you could drop a few hundred each instead, that'd be great. That's what I'm hoping for. Do I think that's going to happen? No. I suspect you have financial constraints on your lives.
They already did Eventbrite donations. So. Sure.
But not hundreds of dollars.
That's exactly the point.
Just ignore the peanut gallery, folks. Pretend like nothing's going on up there.
Tomatoes.
So I think an appropriate way forward is to give up on hope and hopelessness, the two sides of the same con job, and instead enter a period of grieving. And not only that, but consistent with the Grief Recovery Institute's mission to not only enter grief, but also to recover from grief. That's why it's called the Grief Recovery Institute. One of their taglines is, we don't do grief, we do grief recovery. I love their definition of grief, which is wishing for a different past. So here we have hope, wishing for a future, wishful thinking about the future, and here we have grief, wishing for a different past. Seems like we're avoiding the present, which is what we do as humans to our maximum possible extent. So I want to unpack this wishing for a different past a little bit because most people don't understand it. If I'm saying something you disagree with, you can just interrupt without doing that, just so you know. So wishing for a different past. Imagine that you were able to spend time with a loved one as they were dying. They were given a terminal diagnosis. They were given, 6 weeks or 6 months to live, plus or minus. And you were able to spend abundant time with them during their dying days, during their final weeks or months on the planet. And so you had the conversations that you were never willing to have because this culture doesn't allow certain conversations. This culture does not allow us on a daily basis to talk about things like grief and grieving and death and dying and bodily functions and sex. We just don't talk about those. When was the last time you sat down at a meal and said, so, how was your Bristol stool chart today? Bristol stool chart, by the way, shows the variation from defecation, from diarrhea to little tiny pellets. We don't talk about that. This is among the most important thing we could ever do in our life is shit properly, but we never talk shit. When was the last time you talked shit to somebody?
Or
Oh, you're nurses. Okay. I thought there would be normal people attending the talk, but no. So, a dear friend of my partner and I, Pauline's behind the camera there, and a dear friend of ours is house sitting and pet sitting for us where we live in New York State. And he carries about 5 pounds of stuff with him through his daily life. He went to New York with 5 pounds of stuff in his backpack. And that's for 5 weeks. And it's for his whole life, basically. And one of the things he has in this incredibly light life he leads is a paper copy of the Bristol stool chart. Because he wants to keep track of the important stuff. By carrying that around with him, it also prevents talking about sex much, because nobody wants to interact with that man. Anyway, so if we're able to complete relationships with people as they're dying, then we don't experience very much grief compared to if we don't have an opportunity to complete that relationship. If somebody leaves our life through death or divorce or moving away, getting a different job, whatever, if they leave our life without much warning, then we grieve, we wish for a different past. We wish we had had the opportunity to say, I love you. We wish we'd had the opportunity to apologize. We wish we had the opportunity to seek forgiveness. Whereas, if we are allowed to complete the relationship with the person, there's less grief involved. So that's what this wishing for a different past comes from. That's the idea. I'm going to go on. There's this great paper that appeared about 6 weeks ago in Clinical Psychology Forum, a peer-reviewed journal. And I say it's a great paper because I wrote it. So it must be good. And this is the abstract from the paper. And the belief in a positive future, which is how we define hope. Hope is wishing for a good future, right? It negates action. And it's not useful when presenting a person with terminal diagnosis. But this is what we actually did. In this country, through the 1960s, up until at least the mid-1970s, medical doctors, with full support of the medical ethicist community, lied to patients regularly. It was routine business. They wouldn't tell somebody they were dying because they wanted to preserve hope. Hope was viewed as more important than honesty. And corporations and governments and paid climate scientists continue to do the same thing. They don't tell you about abrupt climate change. They don't want to steal your hope. I'm accused every day of stealing people's hope, and I think, yes. But they mean it in a derogatory fashion. It's weird. Anyway, so in this paper, I point out the parallels between how we used to treat individual patients and how we're currently treating our entire species. And maybe we could use palliative end-of-life care as a model for the entire society, for the entire species. So I want to talk just briefly about that. This is the subject of my next book, to be co-authored with the woman behind the camera up there, my partner Pauline. I know about anticipatory grief at scale. That's 9/11. That's 6 million Jews during World War II. This is scale. Anticipatory grief is when you know that person is going to die. You know with great certainty that barring a miracle, grandma or grandfather or your cousin or whatever is on their deathbed, they're going to die. You can anticipate that death, and you can take appropriate emotional and intellectual steps to deal with it. How do we do that at scale? I'm not entirely sure. All I can do is define it in this case. What are the characteristics of hospice? I've never been. I've never been in hospice. I've never been dead. Neither of those has happened to me yet. I'm pre-dead at this point. And I've never been with somebody who was in hospice. My entire family and most of the people I know, we never talk about that. We don't talk about dying. So it's one of those, I don't think anybody in my family would ever go into hospice, because they think it's just weird. So I don't know much about that. I don't know about whether and how to scale up palliative end-of-life care at the level of society. I don't know for you whether you should say something when you're around your family or your friends. You know them better than I do. And for some people, it's just a conversation you don't want to have. Trust me, when you get on an airplane, you're in the aisle seat, there's some poor schmuck sitting in the window seat, and especially if it's an emergency exit row where they got that door, you don't want to bring it up all the time. Only once have I had that woman try to actually pull the window open at 30,000 feet. And that's when I realized maybe I should shut up. Okay, a little bit about the science. We're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. It's not the first rodeo for life on Earth. In the last 500 million years, there have been 5 mass extinction events defined as at least 50% of the species on the planet go extinct. There are at least 16 minor extinction events when more than 25%, but less than 50% of the species on the planet went extinct. So this is not without precedence, in other words. The worst of the 6 so far is called the Great Dying, the end Permian event, some 252 million years ago, when more than 95% of the species on the planet went extinct. The bad news about the 6th, the one we're currently in, is that we're pouring greenhouse gases an order of magnitude faster into the atmosphere than occurred during the Great Dying. And the species extinction rate exceeds that of the Great Dying by about 10 times as well. So what do you know? If we're going 10 times as fast at every measurable level, then maybe at some point we're going to be taken out with it. Despite the fact that books intended for the lay audience have been written about the sixth mass extinction for at least 15 years, at least 20 years at this point, it took the peer-reviewed journal literature until summer of 2015 to catch up, to actually admit that we are, quote, entering the sixth mass extinction. Entering the sixth mass extinction, Ceballos, Ehrlich, and colleagues concluded in the summer of 2015. Entering. At that point, we were at least 15 years in to the sixth mass extinction, according to abundant evidence. But this is an indication of how conservative the peer-reviewed literature is. Ceballos and Ehrlich, again, the second author, about 2 years later, conclude that we're in the midst of biological annihilation. Bear in mind that the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is not National Enquirer. The scientific peer-reviewed journal literature rarely includes the word annihilation. This is the first time I've ever seen it. July of 2017. Second author on this paper, Paul Ehrlich, second author, in fact, on both of the papers, concludes in an interview coincident with the release of this paper that we're toxifying the entire planet. I want to talk today about functional extinction rather than total extinction. Total extinction is when the last member of a species dies. I have no idea when the last individual of Homo sapiens will die in a bunker surrounded by the bodies of like-minded sociopaths when the cans of peaches run out. But I know well before then that we will run out of habitat for our species. We're human animals. We're vertebrates. We're mammals. We too are threatened with the greatest of existential risks. 2 ways to cause functional extinction. Either the inability to reproduce, what is called by conservation biologists reaching the minimum viable population size and then dropping below that, or losing habitat. Again, we are human animals, so as with other vertebrate mammals, we too require habitat in order to persist. So I'm going to point out several means by which we could lose habitat. Total reproductive failure is pretty easy to understand. Here's an example from Kenya, the white rhino. This is the last living male white rhino being consoled by a worker in the conservancy in Kenya where it died, as he died. And that left 2 female white rhinos. This species is functionally extinct, obviously, with only females in the population. This is not our fate. We got enough people in this room to ensure that we will not drop below the minimum viable population size. We got 7.7 billion people on the planet breeding like rabbits. We are not going to be concerned about total reproductive failure. Instead, at some point, and I suspect it will occur in the very near future, we're going to lose habitat for vertebrate mammals, including Homo sapiens. This is a paper that just came out about 10 days ago. It's undated, so I can't tell for sure when it was released, but I think I caught it early on. It's a synthetic paper put out by the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System. By synthetic, I mean they depend upon a bunch of peer-reviewed journal literature to draw these conclusions. And a primary conclusion that is drawn is that an increase of 1.5 degrees, and this is 1.5 degrees above the 1750 baseline, is the maximum the planet can tolerate. Should we exceed that, it could at worst lead to the extinction of humankind altogether. So it could be that 1.5 degrees is sufficient to cause extinction of humans. And in fact, at 1.5 degrees, we've already triggered a refugee crisis beginning in Western Europe with people from Northern Africa and the Middle East flooding into Western Europe. This was happening 4 years ago when I was touring Western Europe, and I was stunned at the response of the typical person in Western Europe. They were outraged that all these brown people were invading from the south. Sound familiar? And we're seeing it in the United States now as habitat for humans disappears in Central America. We're seeing the same in Australia and New Zealand as small island states in the South Pacific are losing habitat for humans. We're seeing the same thing in Alaska on the coastlines where indigenous people are losing their habitats. And the list goes on. So it could be that we have triggered already death by 1,000 cuts as a result of an increase of 1.5 degrees, and that this alone will be sufficient to cause loss of habitat throughout the globe, eventually for humans. 1.5 is particularly problematic because more than 2 years ago we were at 1 3/4. And apparently the authors of this paper with the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System didn't know, because we keep shifting the baseline. Climate scientists used to say 1750, then they started talking 1850, then they started talking about 1900, then 1950, then 1951 to 1980, and now I read all the time that the baseline is 1981 to 2010. That's when the Industrial Revolution began? How did that happen? So if we just ignore the first couple hundred years of the Industrial Revolution, we're in a lot better shape than if we don't. So, according to a paper by James Hansen and colleagues, that was the highest global average temperature ever with Homo sapiens on Earth. And it's warmed up in the last 2 years. I'm going to talk briefly about loss of habitat, primarily by focusing on what's called the McPherson Paradox. No, my ego is not so big that I actually named it. It's named by a friend of mine. And the paradox goes like this. If we increase industrial activity, as we all know, greenhouse gases will increase and continue to warm the planet. We're at 414 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And James Hansen said in 1988 that 320 parts per million was a reasonable target. And worst case scenario, we have to hold it at 350 parts per million. Thus did 350.org conduct their first public act in the fall of 2009, about 9 months after a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences pointed out that at the current levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which at the time was 385 parts per million, we were locked into that temperature rise for the next 1,000 years at least. So 350.org, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, was lying at the time they announced their 350 number. We will never get back to 350. We will never get back to 400. We're in the midst of a crisis that few people are talking about. So continued industrial activity obviously further heats the planet. What most people don't know is that decreased industrial activity heats the planet even faster. So I'll talk about that briefly because people, for the most part, are unfamiliar with the concept. Civilization is a heat engine. It doesn't matter how we power it. Wind turbines, solar panels, wave power, fossil fuels, it all heats the planet. This based on work by Tim Garrett, who was widely disparaged when he first published the idea in 2009, so much so that the paper was removed from public display until February 2011, and he treats civilization as a heat engine. based on the laws of thermodynamics. Notice these are called the laws of thermodynamics, not the strong suggestions of thermodynamics. So this is something that we actually understand about the natural world, and it's happening. How fast? According to a paper from late December of last year, we are headed for climates like those of the Pliocene as soon as 2030. What was the Pliocene like? Well, it happened about somewhere between about 2.6 and 5.3 million years ago, and during the mid-Pliocene, the global average temperature was 2 to 3 degrees Celsius higher than it is today. That's an enormous increase in global average temperature in a short period of time. And remember, we're outstripping the ability of vertebrates to keep up by 10,000 times at slow rates of change, and also outstripping the ability of mammals to keep up. So, this is a problem. The problem gets worse. Sam Karunan, who is smart enough to not use his or her actual name when writing, this is a climate scientist, this is almost certainly a climate scientist in Western Europe who writes with a pseudonym, and he projected a global average temperature rise of more than 10 degrees above the 1750 baseline within the next 10 years when he wrote the paper in 2016. And I took a much more conservative approach, more conservative than the peer-reviewed literature on 2 occasions, and came up with only 22 degrees Celsius, which is commonly viewed as hothouse, or called hothouse, or dinosaur days. It's the most common temperature observed by planet Earth in the last 2 billion years, 22 degrees Celsius. One time the planet has warmed more than that, and that was during the Great Dying, some 252 million years ago, when it went up to 23. So Sam Karunan projects 23 by 2026. I take a more conservative approach and get us here. Recently, a new finding was released from the journal Literature, indicating an additional 8 degrees Celsius temperature rise as a result of loss of clouds. So when Sam Karunan added that into the previous assessment, he gets here by 2026. If that seems inconvenient to you, you're looking at the right line. Okay, so that's civilization as a heat engine, and even if we rely upon the very conservative peer-reviewed journal literature, we're headed for utter disaster in the very near future. And what Karunan does with this assessment is adds together from the peer-reviewed journal literature all the contributors to climate change in the near future. So he adds those things up and comes up with a much higher number than the paper from late December. So that's civilization as a heat engine. What about turning off civilization instead? There you go, the right direction. How could decreased industrial activity lead to rapid heating? It's through the process known as the aerosol masking effect or global dimming. So at the same time, Homer goes to the beach. Homer Simpson goes to the beach, and he puts on these blankets, and that's what we're doing. We went to the beach, it's a party, we put on a bunch of blankets, we burn fossil fuels. The global warming results from greenhouse gases such as methane, carbon dioxide, and water vapor in the atmosphere, and an additional 40 other greenhouse gases. And these greenhouse gases act as a blanket, thus the blanket analogy. And when the sunlight comes in and strikes the Earth and warms up the Earth, these greenhouse gases prevent some of the long-wave radiation from escaping, just as occurs with your car on a sunny winter day. Some of the long-wave radiation, i.e. heat, is trapped in your car, so when you get into it and it's 40 degrees outside, it's actually quite pleasant in your car. At the same time industrial activity produces these greenhouse gases, industrial activity also produces aerosols. And these aerosols go into the atmosphere and act as an umbrella, preventing incoming sunlight from even striking the Earth, acting like an umbrella and keeping the sunlight from further entering the atmosphere. So now Homer's at the beach, he's got all these blankets on because he's not very smart, and he decides to pop up a blanket. Well, he was doing both of those at the same time. He went out there and put the blankets on and put the umbrella up at the same time. This is sometimes called global dimming or the aerosol masking effect. Those aerosols are being poured into the atmosphere. And they're protecting us. If it weren't for the aerosol masking effect or global dimming, we wouldn't be standing here today. Because we have so overheated the planet that without that cooling effect, we would have overheated beyond the ability of our species and many others to persist. How fast? According to a paper by Hansen and colleagues in December 2011, removal of the entire aerosol masking effect. So if we all take a vote, right? So we're going to vote for the really, really new Green Deal. And the really, really new Green Deal is to cease industrial activity next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. So globally, we decided we're going to turn off the switch at that point. No more lights, no more projectors, no more internal combustion engines, none of that. No farmed food, nothing. So we decided to do that. The aerosols fall out of the sky, according to Hansen in an interview conducted a year after this paper came out. All those aerosols fall out in 5 days. The general consensus among other climate scientists is that it will take 6 weeks. It doesn't really matter. It's a short period of time, way less than a growing season, so plants and animals will not be able to keep up with that rate of change. Subsequent paper indicates that the previous paper was too conservative, as is often the case with scientific literature. Levy and colleagues indicate as little as a 35% reduction of industrial activity will cause a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature spike. And a paper earlier this year by Rosenfeld and colleagues concludes that this aerosol masking effect points to a greater amount of warming than we previously thought. So we're being protected by the umbrella we're putting up to a greater extent than we imagined. So it could be that the global financial crisis on a little bit of steroids would be sufficient to reduce industrial activity sufficiently to cause those aerosols to fall out and trigger a global average temperature rise beyond which we could survive. Because the rate of change here is what is really critical. And that could happen any day. I mean, every civilization is 3 days away from disaster. If you have any doubt about that, go to the back alley and watch for a couple of hours in the middle of the day. It's astonishing how much activity is going on as the food and the coffee are being brought into the retail shops. It's all day. We rely completely upon this just-in-time delivery system. And when there's a break in the chain, that's going to be seriously problematic for the whole set of living arrangements. So had I known about the aerosol masking effect, I never would have moved off-grid, given up my incredibly privileged job as a tenured full professor, and go live off-grid and rely upon solar panels and solar pumps and hand pumps and a straw bale house and spent all my money and escaped from the monetary system and shit in a bucket for 10 years. I never would have done that. I gave up this enormous privilege expecting people to follow, and of course nobody did because not everybody's as stupid as I am. And it turned out to be a mistake anyway. Had everybody followed, had even a significant number of people followed, the aerosol masking effect would have kicked in and we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So it's a good thing nobody pays attention to me. You might want to leave right now. I'm surprised you made it this long. I'm a world leader in the category of mistakes that have been made. So I pointed to two means by which we could achieve functional extinction or the loss of habitat for our species. There are a handful of others that I'll skip over very briefly. Natalia Shakova and colleagues at the European Geophysical Union meetings in 2008 indicated that a release of 50 gigatons of hydrate, methane hydrate or methane clathrate, could be released from the relatively shallow sea floor of the Arctic Ocean. In fact, it's highly possible for abrupt release at any time. That's more than 10 years ago. They didn't indicate that an Icefree Arctic was necessary for this to happen. It's highly possible for abrupt release at any time. Secondly, there's methane coming from the terrestrial permafrost as well. Methane in the atmosphere is typically measured in parts per billion. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, about 1750, there was about 750 parts per billion of methane in the atmosphere. In a region known as Yamal in Russia, literally translated means the end of the world, Stretsieleskaya, I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, and colleagues, couldn't we put Smith as the lead author? Really? Concluded that there were more than 8,500 parts per million of methane being released into the atmosphere in their field studies. Parts per million, so this is 8.5 million parts per billion, in other words. And there were 750 parts per billion in the atmosphere when we began the Industrial Revolution. This is a huge number. So there's two means by which methane could be released. Methane is more than 100 times more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, molecule for molecule. So those both are a really big deal. We could have a decline in the grain harvest. This civilization, like all its predecessors, depends upon the ability to grow, store, and distribute grains at scale. Without that ability, this civilization implodes, just like every other civilization. You go back in time and look at the civilizations, and they all collapsed because of the lack of the ability to grow grains sufficiently to keep up with the human population. And if you've been paying attention at all to what's happening in the middle of the United States right now, you know that our grain crops are threatened because of the rain bombs or land hurricane that has settled down over the central United States. That wasn't the only thing. There's political action involving a trade war with China. So the tariffs precluded the farmers from selling their grains early in the year. Instead, they were stuck there in the silos. The rain came and rotted them all out. So there's a combination of a couple of things going on here. But the grain crops have been at least greatly delayed in terms of planting, and a lot of grain crop has been lost from last year. So it could be a decline in grain harvest is sufficient to cause the collapse of the civilization, as with others. Could be an ice-free Arctic projected to occur in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. We're at the 7th of 7 years for that projection from the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences. And what that looks like this year, these are previous years. This is 2012, this is 2007, this is the mean since 1979 when satellite records began, and this is this year through late April. And so it looks like we're headed for the minimum amount of ice at the end of the thaw, which is typically late September. Will it be sufficient to trigger 50 gigaton burst of methane that Shikova and others warned us about? Will it be sufficient to cause, as the president of Finland said, loss of all of the Arctic ice leading to the loss of habitat for humans? I don't know. We'll see. In fact, I had a conversation with Maslovsky, the lead author of the paper in the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences. I talked with Wisław Maslowski, and we barely got beyond hello with a name like that and my ability to pronounce foreign words. So we sat down and talked for about 45 minutes about 2 weeks ago, and he told me that the projection is probably wrong, that we almost certainly will not have an ice-free Arctic this summer, which is the best news I've heard maybe in my whole life. Not much has happened in my life, obviously, but it's really good news for all of us. The president of Finland, in a joint press conference with President Trump on August 28, 2017 in the Oval Office said, quote, "If we lose the Arctic, we lose the globe. That is reality," end quote. And so I think what he was talking about is if we lose the Arctic ice, then we lose habitat for humans throughout the world. And that makes sense. We haven't had an ice-free Arctic for at least 3 million years. Our species has been here about 315,000 years. The Arctic is widely viewed as the planetary air conditioner, and it has great influence over what goes on with the polar vortex or the jet stream. So, good news, it appears that we're going to avoid the ice-free Arctic this year. And that's amazingly good news, because when we lose ice in the Arctic, we almost certainly exacerbate ongoing self-reinforcing feedback loops, or so-called positive feedbacks, and cause the planet temperature to increase at least 5.5 degrees Celsius above where we're at right now, because of the combination of latent heat and blue ocean as opposed to white ice, albedo, and methane release. And you add those things together, and we're headed for a very warm planet within somewhere between a year and a few years after that first ice-free Arctic event. Strone and Bradshaw published a paper late last year pointing to co-extinctions that for the second time in my life I see the word annihilate in the title of a peer-reviewed journal. Annihilate planetary life during extreme environmental change. And by extreme environmental change, they mean a 5 or 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise, which we're almost certain to observe in the wake of an ice-free Arctic. So the longer we can put off that ice-free Arctic, the longer we will have life on Earth. So we don't even need the catastrophic uncontrolled meltdown of the world's 450 nuclear power plants to cause stripping away of the atmosphere and loss of an atmosphere, thus loss of all life on Earth. Instead, that can happen with only abrupt climate change, resulting in the near term from an ice-free Arctic. This is why when Wisław Myslowski told me that we almost certainly would not have an ice-free Arctic, it was one of the happier days of my life. The lead author of this paper, when interviewed coincident with the release of the paper, indicates that even the most tolerant species, and here he's thinking about humans, and we tend to think of ourselves as being very adaptable, even the most tolerant species ultimately succumb to extinction when the less tolerant species on which they depend disappear. So if we lose the filter feeders that clean our water for us, if we lose the pollinators that pollinate food for us, if we lose the decomposers that transform carbon into soil, healthy soil, if we lose any one of those, or any combination of many other things that are likely to happen with the ongoing insect apocalypse, then we're in real trouble because we depend upon so many other species for our own survival. It's not that we're not adaptable, we are. Look, we can pack almost 50 people into a room that the fire marshal says comfortably holds 12, and nobody is very angry yet, despite the things I've been saying. So we're very adaptable, but we depend upon a living planet for our own survival. And we have not been taking good care of our planet in the last several years. I am not, nor have I ever proposed inaction in response to my message. I was interviewed by Tom Hartman this morning, and his conclusion 5 minutes into the interview was that I was telling everybody to just eat steak and burn diesel in their SUV as they drive all around the world. That's not exactly what I said. Instead, I quote Edward Abbey, the desert anarchist, and how fitting for this bookstore. Edward Abbey and his writings were particularly influential for me as a young adult, and he must have written dozens of times, "Action is the antidote to despair." And he despaired then, in the 1970s and 1980s, about what industrial civilization was doing to the planet. And the atheist Edward Abbey also wrote repeatedly, "Sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul." So, I'm not proposing inaction. What does that mean? I just pointed out several factors that could lead in the near term to loss of habitat for humans, and therefore our subsequent demise in the not too distant future. So if I'm not promoting inaction, what am I proposing? What am I promoting? I'm going to quote Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish prisoner of war member during World War II. And he points out that between a stimulus and a response, there is a space. Let's think about that for a minute. Between when we receive the stimulus, such as the information I just provided to you, and our response, which hopefully doesn't involve guns today, there is a space. In that space is the power to choose our response. What you do with this information is up to you. It's not up to me. I never suggested inaction. I'm not telling you to get a big SUV and burn diesel. I'm not telling you to eat a steak. But there's a space between when you hear the message and your response. In that response lies our growth and our freedom. The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances. And Frankl pointed out repeatedly in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that he thought he was going to die within 24 hours. It happened repeatedly. And that was the case for many of his contemporaries as well, for many of the prisoners of war around him. They knew with great certainty they were going to die within the next 24 hours. If I get on this train, all the evidence suggests that I'm going to be dead soon. How did people act? Many people gave the breadcrumbs they received for their meals, they gave them to other people they viewed as less fortunate than themselves. The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances. Put it another way, the best judge of our character is how we act in the face of impossible odds. We're all going to die. How we act on the way out the door, to me at least, is an incredible judge of our character. Again, I'm not telling you what to do. You can get the steak if you want. I wouldn't fault you at all. In fact, no blame, no shame from me. No guilt at all. We're in this together. How you act is up to you. Think about that space between the stimulus and the response and what you do with the information, how you act. So you can do this. You can be this guy. Right? Most of us know this guy. I think that's him there in the back. Yeah, you. Put your hand down. Or you can dance. Or you can pursue a life of service. You can choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances. For me, it's a life of service. I left active service at the University of Arizona and abandoned the monetary system because I thought it was the right thing to do 10 years and 2 days ago. On May 1st, which is important because that's the day we celebrate laborers throughout the world, everywhere except the United States. So I did that by design. I'm still committed to a life of service. As Uncle Ralph tells us, the purpose of life is not to be happy, it is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have made some difference in how you have lived and lived well. I'm firmly committed to a life of service. I'm firmly committed to have a purpose that involves usefulness. And that is where my happiness comes from. That's even where my joy comes from. And so I taught in classrooms for 21 years, and I continued to teach in other fora as well. I met one of my former students about a month and a half ago in Florida, and Mary had taken my conservation biology course in the fall of 2001. With that class and every subsequent science course I taught, I required students to complete a major piece of art or literature as a significant part of their grade. 30% of your grade depends upon this piece of art or literature, and I'm going to give you no guidance whatsoever. I wouldn't even answer the questions. What do you mean like a poem? I don't know. In fact, I thought I was funny. I said, you can do interpretive dance if you want. And then a few years later, a student did interpretive dance to display conservation biology. There were 100 people watching, and they were all crying. So, 18 years later, I see Mary for the first time in the intervening 18 years, and she's moved several times, and she got married, and she adopted an 8-year-old son, and through all of that, she lost almost everything, all of her personal possessions, because moving is, it's hard to keep track of things. But she kept that piece of art that she had done 18 years earlier. And she said it was so powerfully important in how she lived her life that that's why she held on to it. And she cried, and Pauline cried, I cried, and sea level came up 3 inches. And so it's really my fault, that's what I'm saying. So for me, and I'm not telling you what to do again, I will continue to try to spread this message. With my partner Pauline, I've developed a workshop called the Only Love Remains Workshop. It's for people who have come to grips with the notion of near-term human extinction and find it a generally lonely experience. And so they want to know how to proceed with their lives. And they also want to establish some connections that will persist through the days, weeks, or months that we have left. I also continue to submit the interviews. This one is in the major media outlet, the primary media outlet in New Zealand, ditto for Canada, Iran, and Russia. But interestingly enough, although I've been interviewed by the leading media outlets for those 4 countries, I've been regularly defamed by the New York Times and the Washington Post. Take that for what you will. I will continue to do this kind of thing. At some point, obviously, I'll do my last PowerPoint. I'm a master, as you can see, I'm a master of Photoshop, because I put my face in there and it looks like I'm just that guy. I'm really good at this Photoshop thing. I think that's my next career. In any event, I will continue to seek joy. I will continue to tell completely inappropriate jokes at the edge of extinction for as long as I have. I show this picture to remind me to tell you 2 things. One, my latest book came out in February, and I have some copies here that I'll sell. I only have soft covers copies, and they're $15 a piece. My partner Pauline designed the cover. This is the most important story of the day, is to contrast my brilliant photoshopping, Exhibit A, with Pauline's somewhat less worthy effort, Exhibit B. The cover is actually comprised of pictures taken in 3 countries on 2 continents. The beach is Rakino Island in New Zealand, where we were hosted 2.5 years ago. The children are 2 of the kids of her caretaker on her 57-acre property in Belize, and she asked them to throw rocks into the garden. And I'm thinking, I picked a lot of those rocks out of the garden. What the, is that where we want them, really? Just so you can take your silly picture? And then the rocks are replaced with starfish, and they were dried and dead on the wall of her sister in Florida. And so she managed to put that together really quite well. I mean, nothing like this, obviously, but still not bad. And so much of what I have said today you can find in the book, and with a lot more exacerbation of the details. And I'm going to finish by telling a story about the starfish, because that's the point of the book cover, is the story of the starfish. And the story goes something like this. There's 2 kids walking along the beach. There's been a recent very high tide, and it washed up tens of thousands of starfish onto the beach. And now they're beyond the point that the ocean will come up with a regular high tide, and so there are tens of thousands of starfish that are going to die. And there's 2 young kids walking along the beach and picking them up one at a time and throwing them to the ocean. And a cynical old man comes along and he says, "Hey kids, you're not doing any good at all. You're just wasting your time. There's tens of thousands of starfish here. You're not making any difference. You're not going to save them all. Just live your life." And one of the kids says, picking up a starfish, "I'm going to make a difference to this one." Throws it into the ocean. And that's where we are. You and I don't control the strings of empire. We don't have our finger on the button, if there is such a thing. We don't get to decide if we're going to war with Asia or Russia or China or whoever. We don't get to make those important decisions. Rather, we get to make the more important decisions. We get to decide how we act every day with the starfish in our lives. We get to lift people up if we choose. We get to leave the family and friends that are our starfish at high tide on the beach if we want, or we get to take actions that will improve their lives. That's all up to us. That's all we've ever had, you and I. We didn't run for president. Thank you for that. We don't have the kind of control that the so-called powers that be have. We do have control over very little in our lives, including the people who are close to us on a daily or weekly basis. I used to say quite regularly, remain calm, nothing is under control. But then I realized that some things are under our control, and they're the things that really matter to our lives and to their lives. So the story of the starfish is an excellent reminder of the situation we find ourselves in, which is that we actually matter. Yes, with great certainty our species is going to go extinct because of any one of these factors that lies on the near horizon. Does that mean we should act differently than we do today? I think so, but in a positive way. I think we should act with urgency. I think we should act with death in mind. I think we should act as if the people in our lives matter and that the days in our lives matter too. And I think we could have always been acting that way, and maybe even should have. And I didn't. I jumped on the treadmill just like everybody else. That's what we do. The treadmill awaits. And we can't wait to get there. Maybe it's time we jumped off the treadmill and started spending time with the people in our lives that actually matter, and thereby improve the quality of our own lives. I'd be happy to answer a question or two and take your comments as well. Thank you very much for coming. Yes.
You had mentioned the idea of human culture as a civilization, as a heat engine.
Right.
But it's a really big heat engine.
It's a monster heat engine.
And heat engines, besides producing themselves and useful things, produce pollution.
Yes, they do.
That's entered the second law.
Right.
Right. But this thing is so big, human civilization, it's like a hurricane that's spinning. And I don't know, my feeling about it is there's inertia in that wheel, and it's just going. And, we do what we can at the,
Right.
turning around, but...
So is there a question or a comment?
Yeah, just a comment, but
Sure.
what your reaction is to that.
Yeah, civilization is a heat engine that has tremendous momentum, and so probably we're headed for at least a 2 or 3 degree global average temperature rise by 2030. And I'm reluctant to use dates. I used to use dates all the time in presentations like this one. I'm reluctant to use dates because if I say 2030, then almost everybody in the room assumes that it's all good until December 31st, 2029, and then this shit really hits the fan, like overnight. It's not going to be like that. The proverbial crap is already hitting the proverbial fan all over the world. We're in positions of relative privilege. We live in the United States with the world's most effective killing machine at our disposal. So we get food. As I indicated, I lived in Belize for about 2.5 years, and every day people in that country were concerned that they wouldn't have enough food for their families. Every day people were concerned that they wouldn't have water coming through the pipes for their families. Every day on the homestead we were worried about that because the water delivery system was so poorly designed and executed that literally, as quoting from Homer in the Iliad, literally any moment could have been our last because the water delivery system was so horrible. We don't have those concerns here. We have the most amazing technology and infrastructure that we just take for granted. And what I'm suggesting is that we act with gratitude and maybe not take that stuff for granted. It's amazing that it's here, so let's be grateful about it. I don't know who to thank. I hate to think that it's a politician. It's our collective, it's our community. Yes, there's a lot of inertia in the system. However, the climate system on Earth is very, very sensitive. For example, the global dimming I mentioned earlier, somewhere between 5 days and 6 weeks after we slow down the heat engine known as civilization, those sulfates, those aerosols fall out of the atmosphere and warm up the planet very, very quickly. And there's a lot of parts of the climate system that we now know are very sensitive to change.
Could you say a little more if there were any understanding of what the variables are that we're actually not having the Arctic sea ice disappear this year? Or, I mean, just is there more comment you can make about what's happening there?
Yes. So what Maslovsky and colleagues relied upon a relatively small data set. The paper was published in 2012, but the last data point in the data set was 2007, which is right here. At the time, the closest thing to an ice-free Arctic we'd had since satellite records began in 1979. This is 2012. The paper was already out by then. So in 2007, because of this endpoint being so much lower than the others, you can imagine trying to project a line through this. And that's what they did. They used a linear projection. So they tried to shoot a line through the data points. And had this line been up here, the projection would have ended up considerably further out than it did. But this point dragged down the projection, so it went like this and hit 2016 plus or minus 3 years instead of maybe 2019 plus or minus 3 years. And so he said that it was a mistake, and I asked Dr. Maslovsky if he would give an estimate or a prediction about when we would have an ice-free Arctic. And he's like, no. Because he's catching a holy hell for being wrong. He's the lead author of 4 authors on this paper, and people are giving him hell all the time. I can't imagine it would be 10 years, but it might be. I mean, it could be next year, it could be the year after, we don't know. He said, in fact, that the ice is very fragile now. When satellite records began in 1979, the thickness of the ice, on average, was about 3.5 meters. So about 10 feet. Now, 99% of more than 99% of the ice is less than a meter thick. So it's very fragile at this point. To say we're skating on thin ice is something of an understatement. We could have storms that go through, as they did in 2012, and rip the remaining ice all into pieces. So that could happen. He pointed out that it's a pretty fragile system now. He's almost certain we won't get an ice-free Arctic this year, but he's not going to rule it out altogether. He didn't give percentages. He just used words like almost certainly won't have. But it could happen. It's just it's a very chaotic system, as with many natural systems, thereby making it difficult to predict or even project what the future holds. Yes?
What would you say? There are a lot of people who are really throwing themselves at the fossil fuel and interrupting that industry.
Right.
What you're saying tonight, it sounds like you might be suggesting that that's not going to help things and it might actually harm.
I think there's a bunch of people who are really misinformed. We hear almost every day from the corporate media that we just need to reduce emissions and we'll be fine. But because of this catch-22, reducing emissions also reduces the aerosols in the atmosphere, and so that's probably not a good idea. If we could simultaneously reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and also keep the aerosols going into the atmosphere, that'd be the best case scenario, but we have no idea how to do that. So I see lots of groups such as Deep Green Resistance and Idle No More, and they just haven't kept up with the literature. When I moved to the homestead in New Mexico and bailed out on the monetary system 10 years and 3 days ago, and I'd been making plans for 3 years before that, I knew nothing about global dimming. And had I known about global dimming, I never would have made that mistake. I would continue to enjoy my privilege, which included the ability to interact with young people, which I loved, and I would have enough money that I could go around telling everybody on the planet they're doomed. That'd be way more fun.
What about the methane feedback loop?
Yeah, so methane is...
40 times.
No, it's more than 100 times more
Exactly.
powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. And we are seeing an enormous increase since 2007 in the atmosphere. At what point does that cause the global average temperature to go beyond the ability to inhabit the planet by humans? I don't know. All the evidence indicates that the methane bomb has been released from the terrestrial permafrost and also from the relatively shallow sea floor.
Who says that?
Who says the methane bomb has been released? You look at the exponential increase of methane in the atmosphere since 2007,
It's bubbling in Siberia.
which nobody denies, the exponential rate of increase since 2007. And it's difficult to imagine that something catastrophic is not going on.
So there's a feedback loop.
Yes, there is. This is one of 69 self-reinforcing feedback loops that I mention in a long essay called Climate Change Summary and Update at guymcpherson.com. This is one of 69 of them. More methane means more heating. More heating means more release of methane from terrestrial permafrost and also from the relatively shallow seabed of the Arctic Ocean. But there are a bunch of other self-reinforcing feedback loops as well.
Read through my social media about artificial clouds, that there's some people saying that they want to create shelter or dimming.
Terra.
Is that in your loop or is that?
There's an experiment going on right now conducted by David Keith at Harvard, supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in New Mexico, in which they are actually attempting to go beyond seeding clouds and pouring sulfates directly into the atmosphere to try to cool that region. But it's a relatively small scale experiment. I think it's a really bad idea. In the summer of 2015, the United States National Academy of Sciences conducted an overview of all the evidence known so far up till that point and concluded that geoengineering in that manner would not improve the situation and likely would make it worse. And they specifically pointed to solar radiation management, such as the kind of work that David Keith is doing right now. A European body of similar stature to the National Academy of Sciences pointed out the same thing the same year. So I think we're really playing with fire here, that we've never known the full effect of burning fossil fuels, and we kept burning them anyway. So I don't think that's a viable strategy. But on the other hand, if we're faced with human extinction as a result of reduction in industrial activity, a lot of people think it's a good idea to do some sort of replacement of those aerosols into the sky.
Get rid of capitalism.
And by getting rid of capitalism or socialism or any other ism, we reduce the aerosol masking effect and drive ourselves to extinction even faster. So I think we're beyond the point. We're beyond pointing fingers at any ism or any group. We all did this. All the vegans, all the carnivores, all the people who lived off grid, like I did, using composting toilet for a decade. All the people who did anything involved with living. Living takes life, period. We're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction, period. We're in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change, period. Shaming and blaming and guilting are completely inappropriate strategies to deal with people in our lives from this time forward.
Looking forward past this extinction, will anything survive? Will plants of any sort survive, or will it be bacteria? Is there any, I'm just curious, what comes next?
Yeah, after several...
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. Based on the previous 5 mass extinction events, what happens in the wake of this one? Does anything survive? Will there be small things, or will there be nothing at all? Is that an appropriate characterization of the question? The previous 5 mass extinction events required millions of years, several million years, for recovery beyond the small things. And most of what persisted was small things, fungi, bacteria, and microbes. There's a species of microbe that is found only 7 miles below the surface of the Earth. I don't think we can kill it. I think no matter what we do, we can't kill that microbe within the next few years. Try as we might. I just think it's going to get away from us. You know, we'll be writing books, the one that got away. It's that microbe. However, the paper by Strona and Bradshaw, Scientific Reports, November 13th, 2018, indicates that 5 to 6 degree global average temperature rise destroys all life on Earth. Now, it's interesting because in that same paper, they did something I never thought I would see in a peer-reviewed journal article. They argued with themselves. They said, this is the way it looks, this is the outcome, this is the result of our study, the loss of all life on Earth. And we can't imagine that happening, so it probably won't. What? You know, I can't imagine a bus hitting me when I walk out in the street. But if I walk out in the street often enough, a bus is going to hit me, whether I imagine it or not. So, will it happen? We don't know. Will it happen as a result of a rapid global average rise in temperature? We don't know because we've never been here before. I suspect that the catastrophic uncontrolled meltdown of the world's 450 and change nuclear power plants will cause ionizing radiation to strip away the atmosphere of Earth and leave us looking a lot like Mars, not Venus, and therefore be a lifeless planet. But I don't know. This is one of those cases where it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. All the way in the back.
Did the nuclear bomb test that occurred in the 50s and 60s have much of an effect on this?
Well, it depends on what you define as much effect.
Big when the Russians blew off up near the North Pole.
Right. So there remains a relatively lifeless zone around, well, let me be careful about this. Around Chernobyl in Russia, which melted down in 1986, there is an area that humans are not allowed to inhabit. And people have been pointing out that there's lots of wolves and other large species that have been apparently succeeding in the wake of human activity. However, it's far too early to make the claim that the situation has been improved by Chernobyl. Ionizing radiation causes lethal mutations. We know this. Within 5 or 6 generations after those lethal mutations begin, most species go extinct. We know this. So probably we're facing a human extinction event from the likes of Chernobyl and Fukushima and whatever comes next, all by themselves. But it will take many generations to play out.
Do
So,
you know the book, The End of Ice?
yes, I do.
What's his name? I lost it.
His name is Dar Jamail, pronounced Jamail. And he was a friend of mine.
Tell me about it, please.
The part where he was a friend of mine? Do we want
Tell
to
me about it. Tell them, the audience.
do we want to get into every betrayal that's impacted my life in the last 20 years? I think that'd be highly entertaining for you. Kind of a bummer for me.
I'm listening.
Yeah.
So I share your skepticism about geoengineering experiments. Honestly, they scare me. Honestly, I'm not sure what I'm scared more of. Near-term human extinction, or a world that succeeds with geoengineering, that we have a world that's completely and utterly administered by civilization. Of course, it is now to some level, but unconscious level.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And again, we don't have any control over any of that. Nobody's going to get to vote on whether we start a nuclear war. None of us are going to get to vote on when we start doing massive geoengineering through solar radiation management. We're not going to get a vote on those things. There have been rogue attempts to geoengineer, including throwing a bunch of iron filings into the ocean. That, as it turns out, was a valuable scientific experiment, although illegal, because it showed us about the rule of unintended consequences. The situation was worsened instead of improved by dumping those iron filings. So it was a clever little experiment that we should have never run. So,
Well, it's going to happen,
Uh,
but should it be resisted? I feel like it should.
so yeah, I think resistance is a great idea. And I think nobody cares. You know, I think the whole world resisted before Iraq War #2. I don't think there were 38 people on the planet who thought that was a good idea. And the United States just forged on with the coalition of the unwilling. So again, it seems to me those of us in this room don't have much control over what happens at the world level, except at the level of our own world, and the ability to influence the lives of the people around us. So for me, that's where the focus ought to be. And it is for me. This is almost certainly my last speaking tour, which makes this my last public presentation. Because it's time for me to focus on the individuals in my life, the 3 of them still left, that matter to me. It's time for me to focus on living, on pursuing excellence and pursuing love, as I've been telling people to do for a decade. Because clearly I've not moved the needle one bit, except in terms of 42 or 43 people. But the level of society, I've made no significant change.
So what do you think it's going to take to move that needle?
I think the last denier will reveal themselves as they take their last breath. They'll be the last person on the planet. There's no changing the runaway train known as civilization. There's no changing the society. In my mind, I tried, I did everything. I threw everything I had at it. You know, for 21 years in the classroom, I implored my students to not make more babies. And there were 3 or 4 of them who took that advice seriously. Among thousands of students, there were 3 or 4 of them who managed to resist the biological urge, which is overwhelming. And I know it's overwhelming. I've taught natural selection. I know what we're up against here. Even Nietzsche gave up on the Superman, the Übermensch, late in his life, because he knew that the biological urge is just profound. So again, I keep returning to the primary point, which is you and me and us and here and now. And that's it. And that's enough. I'll stop right there. I'll stay for as long as anybody wants. Thank you.